let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining. Again, please register your attendance in the meeting notes, which I pasted into the chat. And a reminder that we'll abide by the Linux Foundation Code of Conduct. Does anyone have topics for today? I actually have made no significant progress on the V1 stuff because I was busy with other work. I've been working on, as I mentioned at the end of last week, an update to the proposal, the provenance format, actually, which I see Aaron listed. I could share what I have so far. It is like totally I've had some review, like Sean, for example, took a look at it and gave some feedback. I've gotten some feedback from some people, but like it's not undergone formal review or like is particularly good. Here's I'm doing the schema in proto format because well, it's just easier, frankly. And then I'll figure out how to transform that into something if it's good. Someone else typing. So no updates. Well, I don't have any updates. Does anyone else have updates on the spec? I know there was some talk about the manual verification piece. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to follow it. I didn't have time to look at that yet.
And Mark, that 508 is the manual verification issue, I believe, which is the one I linked. I don't know who KPK47 is, but they have some very smart comments in there that I am admiring for sure in the issue. Nice. Chris?
Yeah, that's Chris here.
Nice.
I wondered the same thing until Chris said, oh yeah, that's me. So yeah, we should go through and is there anything we want to talk about that?
Yeah, I guess, Mark, I was just, my simple question there, around the attestation spec, are we including that as well within the scope for this body of work?
I mean, ideally we would. We're kind of, I think we really want to get this, I think pressure's mounting to have some release. I don't know if anyone has other thoughts. I don't view it as a hard blocker for 1.0 unless like there's a reason that like the current format is insufficient and we need to make a change. I did start looking at it just independently because I was having parallel conversations with a couple other teams who were confused by the current format. Like they kept getting caught up on the same rough edges of the V0.2 format. And so I thought, let me just try to gather everything that like in my head for changes and like aggregate that all and just like put it in a schema together to see if that would work better for these couple SLSA integrations that we've been working on. And so far the feedback has been positive. And so maybe we should do that. I just haven't got, if you look at the thing, there's like a bunch of to-dos in there and like open questions. And like I just made a change today and I refactored all things. So it's like very in flight. But so far it seems like a positive change. And so maybe we should just do that and call it draft. And that way we have something, we could do that in parallel to the spec work.
Okay. Yeah, and just the last piece on the agenda item that I put on there, the outcome of Chris's and Marcella's conversation in that issue. I thought it was excellent conversation in there, and Chris proposed some action items out of it that had specifically to do with that attestation spec. So I thought that was like a good thing to come out of this discussion.
Yeah, well, why don't I present what I have so far in like that have been put together, and then we could see if that addresses some of the things, and maybe I could also record more things to do. So let me present. So here is the, well, it's probably easier to look at an example rather than the proto is like very verbose, but is full documentation. I'm hoping that like I could write it in a better schema language like protobuf and then parse that and turn it into Markdown. I just haven't figured out the tooling yet for that. So the idea would be, so one thing I'm having conversations with is like, how do you record what a Docker-based build would be? So this would be something that might look like, I don't know if this is, let me zoom into it. The main change would be we add 2 levels of nesting, because right now the build type is a top level field. We have one thing called config, what's it called? Config source, I think. And it assumes that you have a single top level input artifact. And there's entry point parameters, which is unchanged. And so the couple of changes I thought would be valuable and based on feedback would be, one, at a high level, separate the kind of the pure inputs from the impure inputs, or like the build definition would be the thing that is like the input to the build. Every time, like different parties can run this build definition and get an output. If it's reproducible, it'll be the same bit for bit identical output. If it's not reproducible, you get a different output. But still, that's kind of like the definition of what you're doing. And then the run details would be the stuff that like every invocation is going to be different. So like who performed the build, what their run ID was, the timestamps, etc. Also added byproducts, which we'll talk about. But then within build definition, and this is a change I made this morning, so again, I don't know if this is any good. It seems like it would be valuable to have top level inputs, which are kind of like the independent inputs that we have to verify, because those are like the knobs that users can change. And so you need some expectation of like, was this good? And ideally you make that part as small as possible, because the fewer parameters there, the fewer things that you have to verify. And then dependencies would be like all of the resolved things that like that either the build environment provided, like the build system provided, or like resolving dependencies, etc. And so I'm hoping that like this kind of nesting makes it a little bit more clear like what the purpose of each thing is. Yeah, Michael.
Do we want to allow, for example, those inputs to be definable, also like to be potentially have a schema based on the build type? Because that was one of the things that we were kind of talking about potentially, so that someone new, like a rebuilder, can go and say, yep, I am a Docker rebuilder. So if I see build type Docker build, I know how to ingest things like, because there might be some additional metadata that might be specific to individual, like a Docker rebuilder inputs or Go rebuilder inputs.
You mean like in this field? In like each?
Yeah, in each of those fields, or like, because I think that there's probably going to be a bunch of stuff that's probably shared, but I can imagine specifically in the parameters piece is probably where most of that might be a bit different.
Yeah, this is what I did here is I called it, which is the same as the current version, just call it like In protobuf form, it's called a struct. Here, it's just like an arbitrary JSON object whose schema is defined by type.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. And do we want to, is there anything we can do to sort of, I guess, encourage actually defining that? I mean, I think not necessarily for 1.0, but I know one of the things that's been happening lately is a lot of folks have lots of different build types, but none of them are actually defined by a schema yet.
I see. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, we should do that. Another, so a couple of changes, like one is input artifacts, instead of just having a single top level thing, which seems in practice, like we keep running into the issue that there's like often multiple things, like the source that's being built, but then in this case, like a Docker image that you're running the build on, that's an independent input. And then maybe a third one, which is like the binary that's putting them together, the version of the binary that's putting them together. And so these would be kind of all three independent inputs. But you wouldn't list all the resolved dependencies. That would go down here, optionally. The other, and like the meaning of entry point, just like in the current version, would be dependent on the build type. And so these names here would have like special meaning based on the build type. And I listed some suggested convention for what possible names are, but you could put arbitrary names here. It's a map. And then the other real significant change was the byproducts, which would be, this is the term from the in toto link format. Additional outputs that are not like the main output, like I listed two example things in the schema. Logs is a common one. I think Sean might have suggested that. And then also, if you have like a resolved configuration of like you parse this thing and then you do a bunch of stuff and you have some actual object that maybe you need for reproducing or something like that. You could list it here. If you want to like the hash of it, you could list here, which could be useful for like debugging or something like that. But you wouldn't want to like inline all of that because it's most people wouldn't actually need it. And so it's a way to reference outputs without actually including them or calling them the subject, which is kind of misleading too. Anyway, that's what I had so far. I don't expect everyone to like take it in and form thoughts, but I want to kind of share this in case people want to dig in. And again, the schema's here. Hopefully it's understandable if you're not familiar with protobufs. Jack?
Right. So would every single builder ever need to have its own definition? Like, here we've got a Docker builder. What happens if I have, a different package manager? I've got Webpack, Vite, all these different things do builds. Are we going to have top level definitions for everything?
I think there's a trade-off here, because what we want to effectively, this build type is encoding a bunch of information, and the more information we encode in the build type, the less information it has to go here, which makes it easy to verify because you just know, oh, this is a Webpack build, or more generally an NPM build. And I know how to do that. And it has like all sorts of logic of like, okay, first, maybe it's like you run npm publish, or if there exists a script called build, you run that, or whatever that is. And that has value, but then yes, you'd have to define one per whatever thing you're doing. An alternative would just be like, run an arbitrary command. And then the entry point would be like an arbitrary shell command. But then the difficulty is, well, the advantage would be you would only have to have one build type and it would cover a bunch of things. But the disadvantage would be there's a lot of complexity in the entry point. It would be like, again, an arbitrary shell command. And so if someone was building with, say, make, and then it was like you'd run like make build, and then they changed the name of the target to make something else, like just for a pure refactor, that might show up here and look like a significant change. It would be kind of difficult to know what's significant, what's not. And so in my opinion, at least, there's kind of a trade-off there for like how much work we do up front versus like ease of verification.
Could you not just have most of the benefits by defining what the result is? So you have like, I don't know, a PURL or whatever that says I am outputting this, and then, you know, this was my entry point, whether the entry point changes from running this script or that script, you know, the result is this. You still want to review what's being ran to build the thing anyway. I mean, maybe this is good for extra detail, but I'm thinking if there isn't like a fallback default version people can use, it's going to be prohibitive to use this format unless you're like getting an approved top level.
Yeah. So this is actually something that I know in my notes for that one thing I was talking about before was I think it might be worthwhile to say there might be some, regardless of build type, there probably should be some set of default things. And then you can have additional things defined in each build, like a build type can define extras, but there should be like a minimum. So as Jack mentioned, so that somebody who doesn't have the tooling that, let's say, knows how to do a Docker rebuilder can still parse through, let's say, everything but the Docker rebuilder specific specific attributes. Does that make sense?
Was that directed to me or Jack?
Oh, I think to you, Mark.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so like one option would be, and a lot of other things, just like instead of just entry point being like this kind of generic thing, it could be a command. Like some things just list like literally a command. And on Linux, that would be a shell command. On Windows, I don't know exactly what that would be. I guess, yeah. Again, on Mac, I don't know enough about Mac. My only worry is things like let's say you were running a GitHub action. Command doesn't really make sense because that's not the interface that you invoke a GitHub Actions workflow. You invoke it with this config file and some trigger or something like that. So it's not really running on a single system where you run a command, but it's really actually a distributed system.
Oh yeah, I think in this particular context, I think the idea is just to say there might be shared elements across all build types, right? There might be just some shared elements so that if I have a tool that only like that doesn't understand, like it's just a parser and it's parsing through some interesting information, it's only going to pull out information it understands. And if the idea here is it needs to understand all build types, right, that it could potentially ever interact with, that could be an issue compared to, hey, it doesn't understand all build types. It understands, you know, some generic stuff and is able to pull out all the generic information. And then, you know, for tools that do need to understand some of that additional information, it could be relegated there. Jack?
Yeah, so the next thing that comes to mind now that you mentioned GitHub Actions is this then confuses everything because I may be building a Docker container, so you maybe put the Docker build top level, but I'm doing that in Actions or Tecton or Jenkins or, you know, any kind of CI platform. So now the top level is always going to be the CI. It's just slightly confusing.
Yeah, that would be, I think it depends what you are doing. So this one, this was, again, this is specific to a project we were working on, so there's not enough documentation here. If you're wrapping the whole CI build and calling that the build, then yes, it would be like the entry point would be Jenkins or Circle CI or Google Cloud Build or GitHub Actions or whatever. If like that's like you just call that whole thing the build, and that's like the part that's trusted. Which in a lot of cases, like those things are complex, and so that's kind of what you'd wrap around. In other cases, which I think is, like most services, like that is the thing, and everything inside of it is opaque, and so that's really all that the service can attest to, is that it ran the whole thing. Other ones like this would be, the context here is I think more reproducible builds, that where you have some input, some container image that in which you run some command. Again, this is like very hand wavy. I don't know if this isn't actually the real design. And there, like, this would be some specific, maybe this is too confusing, I think, but another one might be like an NPM build, where you have some heuristics for how to run it. Again, maybe you're right. Maybe in most cases, we could just define a simple thing like run a command, and the command is like, if we keep that thing simple, like npm publish, you're done. And it's an easy enough entry point that you don't really need additional things. And did I really address what you were saying?
Yeah. I'll need to have another read over it and have a think. I usually, so I'm more used to the Nix method of building. So like the kind of reproducible part of this provenance is kind of also combined with like the SBOM elements of your inputs. And that's one thing. And then the impurities of which system did the build, who did the build, is a totally separate kind of recording.
Yeah, that's in fact how I was the inspiration of this split between build definition, top run details. I don't know if it was you or someone else when presenting about Nix said that specific thing about the salsa provenance, and so that's why I did that split. Where like this is the, I don't know the Nix terms, derivation, is that what it's called?
Yeah, the derivation is the term. Yeah, typically I think of anything that's like reproducible. I always think of it as, a build input. This, what you run to do the build is as important as, what other inputs you have, like libraries and whatever. So I feel like it all fits better with that kind of data. And then the run details, yeah, I think of it as like a separate document. Has anyone considered separating these out into two separate pieces rather than one individual file?
I discussed that some with one of my colleagues. I don't think, because like ultimately this whole thing is a signed statement saying that so-and-so attests to the fact that you got, this input, and the subject, which isn't shown here, was the output. If you
so
just,
like you'd
sorry.
take this top bit, you'd put it in a file, you'd get its hash, you'd then put that in your run details, and then you'd have assigned run details. So the signed run details would point to the specific other file that you have, and it should be linked.
Yeah, I think that would be a fine way of doing it. I don't know if, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly open to it. I think the one or two people I talked to originally, it was more around like until we need because that adds extra complexity, because you have to do another hash operation, explain, and then you also have to you now have this thing as an out of band, or like not out of band, but like a separate document that has to get propagated. Whereas right now, the whole attestation is like one unit, and you could parse it, and then you have all the information you need to compare this to some sort of policy or expectations. If you split it out, you then need to send both of them, like the attestation, which is the currently called the run details, which includes the hash of the other thing, and then the other thing itself. I think that's a fine way of doing it. It's just more like, do we have a use case for why we would need that?
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents is just, I think it's probably fine if the 2 sections are split out as they are, because you could always just download an attestation. Well, you could, it wouldn't be that hard to split it yourself and then be able to take like hashes of the inputs or whatever.
Yeah. My inclination is to include it in one document just because it's easier to work with. Because I think the consumers of this would be expected to want that most of the time. Like they would almost never want just this without the run details or without the build definition.
I've been thinking about the separating stuff for some other things as well. Like, yeah, it would be a bit more of a pain to keep track of these documents, but I mean, you're gonna have a separate SBOM at some point. The other thing, I'm not sure if there's been much discussion, but yeah, if my SBOM just says, well, I'm using this Go, then I have an SBOM for that copy of Go. How am I going to link to that? So I think there's going to be quite a few cases of you have multiple documents you need to chain together, or you end up with like a mega document. And your mention of logs earlier kind of reminded me of that as well. Like if we start embedding logs in the provenance, that's going to get big. Then people want, eBPF or strace traces. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, for sure. My inclination was to do, as you said, and like have at the top level, like even just 2 hashes, like one for this thing and one for this thing or something like that. And so you could like split them out and only include the pieces that you care about. And I think my colleague errs on the other side of like the you ain't gonna need it type of thing of like, let's try to keep things simple until we know we need it. If we have like a clear use case for having it be split, where, for example, like would the build definition be checked into version control or something like that? Or there's some reason why we would want to hash it, then I think that would make the argument stronger.
Yeah, not to complicate things, but I know a lot of folks are talking about stuff like when it comes to all these attestations and stuff like that, does like separate from SLSA, right? Does it make sense to have a a attestation or whatever, right? Like something that says, hey, here's the category, we've seen all these attestations regarding this thing, an SBOM, SLSA attestation, whatever, like in total layout that we, whatever. And so all of this is stuff that we've seen, and here's us signing off, or also stuff where folks have said, hey, in like the OCI case, stuff like you can list the attestations just in the manifest in this, in the manifest, and be able to do it that way. So there's a bunch of different things that I think folks are talking about there. So I think I would kind of, personally, I think it's kind of external to this, right? Where you might just say there needs to be, we want to suggest folks to be able to say, yes, a SLSA attestation and it exists here, and there's an SBOM and it exists here, and whatever. As opposed to just sort of tying it all together in a single document. Oh no, did Mark just get disconnected? Hey, Mark, you with us?
Does look like he froze.
Yep. Okay, I see his video's back. Mark, can you hear us?
One thing we could do in the meantime was Melba, did you have a number of items that I saw on the agenda next? I mean, you could skip ahead potentially. Oh, if Mark's back.
Yeah, sorry, I gotta set up some better Wi-Fi situation in my house. So once Michael stopped talking, that's when my thing dropped. So I didn't hear anything that happened since then.
Oh yeah, that was about it. It was just sort of saying I think wait until there's some use cases, because I think there's a lot of other folks who are saying, hey, I would rather have that in a Docker manifest or whatever.
Sounds good. So in terms of next steps, I'll read through the issue 508. Aaron, was there more you want to talk about here?
No, this was pretty good. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to read through it and see if there's any more to do out, and then I'll get into a decent enough state that where we could start a pull request, and that way we could actually start commenting on it. But feel free to, like, if you want to look at it now, fork it and play around with it, or talk to me or whatever. I think Melba had the next issue or the next topic.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the last SLSA meeting. I did create an issue for it. Essentially, there seems to be a discrepancy in, let me do a portion of my screen here so that way it's easier for folks to see. Where the draft says for level 1, it makes no claims about not being on the a user's workstation, versus level 2 says it's not on a developer's workstation. But one of the benefits that's called out for build level 1 is that it says prevents mistakes during the release process, such as building from a client with local modifications. So I'm interpreting that to mean a developer's workstation, and I feel like this benefit should be in level 2, unless, maybe this assumption actually isn't a level 2 statement, it's more of a level 1. So I'm just trying to get clarity, and then obviously I can try to go fix this page if necessary, but we were trying to write a blog around the benefits and saw the discrepancy.
Yeah. So first, I agree. The word, like, it's unclear. I could say what was, like, going on in my head, at least. So I was thinking that at level, like at the top level, and I don't think it's explainable enough. And I'd like to figure out how we could do this better. Like level 1 would be controls that are in place to like you publish provenance and you do things to stop people from making mistakes. So like you set some expectation where it's supposed to be published, and there's some sort of control to prevent them, ideally prevent, or at least detect when people do the wrong thing by mistake. But it is like trivial to evade. You could just like change, it's like an unsigned file, just change one thing. It's like no effort is spent to like stopping people from evading it. But there, the preventing mistakes, I was thinking would be something like, for example, if a package repository has a thing that says like, upload time, it checks that it was built from this particular Git repo without, from like a commit in that repo. And the client tooling creates provenance saying it was built from there, where it was built from. And then at upload time, it checks that. And so if you build from your local machine, that would be allowed at level 1, but it would not allow you to have like a dirty state. Like make sure that, for example, there's no untracked changes in Git, and the local commit matches at least one of the remotes in Git. I think, for example, Rust does this. If anyone here knows Rust, there's like cargo -- allow dirty or something like that. Versus at level 2, you wouldn't. That check would still happen, but there'd be more controls in place, so that way you'd have to actually. So the difference in my mind between level 1, level 2, and level 3 is at level 1, we're just preventing mistakes. Anyone could trivially get around it. Level 2 would be there's an actual security control in place, and people would have to perform some sort of attack to do it. Like the builds run on a service, because like there's no real way to lock down a local machine other than some sort of trusted computing something or other, but we're going to ignore that for now. So like run it on a service, and the secrets are specific to that service. And so in order to attack it, you'd have to like do some sort of exploit to withdraw the keys. It's not particularly difficult, but it would be like a fireable offense if you're an employee. And so there's, like policy, and there's some amount of work, there's some barrier to entry. And so not everyone's going to just do it. Not everyone will know how to do it. And there's some disincentive for doing it. And then level 3 would be like a stronger security where you really need to be pretty advanced to know how to evade it. Anyway, that was my thinking.
So then client with local modifications was meant more from whatever code that you may have copied from, let's say, Git onto your local machine hasn't strayed from the original source during build. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, like was the code that you built from, does it match the upstream repository?
Okay.
As opposed to
yeah.
you modify a client on your local machine and then build from that, which is actually a pretty common mistake that people do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then I'll update the GitHub issue, because that makes more sense now, based off of that wording. So I'll update the GitHub issue and try to push up a different wording for that benefit.
I might be missing something here, but so if I understand correctly, the benefit of, was it level 1, is that you don't have these modifications, but what in level 1 is, picking up, you've changed Git in some way, you've changed the files locally.
Yeah, that's, I think, something we need to work out. So either define that in the requirements or remove that from the benefit. My thinking would be that it would be some sort of within, like to call something level 1 means that there exists that control in the end-to-end flow. So for example, if, let's take cargo for an example. With cargo, it already has client-side tooling that prevents you from doing that already. Although I think it doesn't check that the commit actually exists in the upstream, so that would still have to exist. It does prevent you from doing it, from like having uncommitted changes in your local client. And if cargo at, say, upload time or even in the client-side tooling, or I don't know, somewhere in the end-to-end flow, if there's some sort of roadblock where if you build from something that's not the upstream, a commit that's on the upstream repo or equivalent in other version control systems, that it would block you. What do you think of that, Jack?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. It's just, yeah, I hadn't seen that on the website just yet. But yeah, if we're gonna add that, that sounds good.
If I may interject, I think the use of local here might be confusing. In fact, what you mean is the build environment, right? You want the build environment, the code that you're building of matches the repository, the master or the main repository, because local, is that, I mean, yeah, local to the build, right? But it could be in cloud for all I know, and I could still modify the code there and build from this. And so I think that's not the right qualification.
For certain. Thanks, Arna. If anyone wants to take a crack at better wording, both, I think it's clear that we need both the changes on the levels page of talking about the benefits to better explain this, as Arna said, and also on the requirements side to show that like this type of thing actually gets stopped, because both of those I think are missing. Anything more here? Okay. One last thing. We talked in the past about the terminology. I put together a document. Let me present. Containing just a proposal for terminology that we would add to the existing terminology page. Right now, if you look at the terminology page, we have a whole section on build and what the model is, which probably could use some work, but that's a separate question. But nothing around package. We just say package and that's it. Similarly for dependency, but although I didn't get into that in this thing. I think ideally for source, package, and dependency, we kind of go into those details, and we have issues around this of like ironing out of like different model things. But this doc concerns itself just with package, because the term is ambiguous. Like, is it an artifact, like a thing that can be hashed, like for example, a tarball or a deb file or something like that? Or is it the kind of like the logical concept of, curl, or is it like literally the curl version, whatever, tarb.gz? And so what I propose here is that basically we never use the word package unless that ambiguity is okay. And then that we use more specific terms, artifact to mean the actual hashable thing, and project to be like effectively the name. That's the term that Python uses, I believe. Like for example, in Python, the requests project is the thing under the name pypi.org/requests. And so it's kind of like the thing that you could attach a policy or expectations to. It's like a thing that has a source location, so an owner, etc. And then also because if we need these terms, define like what do we mean by ecosystem, what do we mean by registry, because different ecosystems, well, ecosystem would be good to say what we mean by that. And then registry, some things call this a registry, some things call it a repository. Yeah, I'll just delete that. Authority, in my opinion, would be a completely fine alternative. And so I started to list some examples here. Oh, let me turn on comments. I realize I'm not getting notifications. I didn't see any of these notifications. And I think it would be valuable if we could like list out, any ones that we know about and put them here. So that way when we talk about, you can make it concrete, because if you know, for example, Maven, you could say, okay, when SLSA says registry, it means a repository. And SLSA says project, it means this or whatever. I don't know if any of these are correct. And so if you know any of these, that would be good to fix. Hopefully this is a start for something that we could do. I'm open to changes of the terminology. Again, this is a starting proposal because it's easier to start with something than to start with nothing. Michael?
Yeah, this might be something we want to get the LF a bit more involved with more broadly, because had a couple of conversations with a few folks over at KubeCon about this problem. And I think the problem, we were calling it like the ontology problem of like everybody calls stuff a little bit differently, even if semantically they kind of mean the same thing and yada yada. And so there was Docker. So like Justin Cormack from Docker brought this up. Matt Young, who I think is at Apple now, but he was doing a bunch of stuff from the CNCF. He was bringing this up. Justin Kapos, who from NYU, who does stuff. Oh, nice. Yeah, so I think this was something that was kind of a big issue that was brought up at KubeCon, is that given that everybody's terming things slightly differently inside of some of these things, it becomes difficult to sort of understand the mapping to say, hey, this is what it looks like in the SLSA world, and this is what it looks like in this world. And so that would make the interoperability between all the different tools a little bit easier. Yeah,
could you start a thread or something like that with the various folks?
Sure.
If you have the contacts. Yeah, because Jay White mentioned last week that he'd start. I haven't heard from him since. And Jay's right here. Cool.
Yeah, I was hoping to get someone from. There's actually a glossary being worked on, and I was hoping to get one of the individuals that's working on that glossary on this call today. They had a bit of a scheduling conflict this morning, so they couldn't be here. But the idea is to get them on this call with us to go over what they're working on in the glossary. That's supposed to be a governing glossary for all of these kind of terms across the OpenSSF, right? So that's what we and the idea, and I pitched this to them like we talked about last week. These terms here versus the terms being worked on in the glossary and sort of cross reference one another, so they can take terms from this, put that in there, take those terms, we bring them here, so that everything is on one sheet of music, right? There's not the different terms going across different projects underneath the same OpenSSF umbrella, right? So that was the general idea with that. But I'm trying to get those schedules to sync up so that way they can come on and present what they've been working on glossary wise. I was even attempting to get a copy of the glossary in its current form. I wasn't able to snag that, so I figured the next best thing would be to get someone working on it to come on over and actually talk about what's all been done so far. I really hope you guys heard all that.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, we talked last week about, you know, not getting blocked on any sort of larger agreement. The first step, I think, would be like talking and seeing. Ideally, for SLSA, we'd have the fewest terms necessary. Like we'd only do the ones that are necessary to get the job done. Like the fewer terms you have to learn, the better. And so that would be valuable because like we could just, if we could agree on like, well, although there's all sorts of other concepts that you might want to define, what SLSA needs is, assuming that these are the ones that we actually want, like package, artifact, project, reg ecosystem, and publish, let's say, which, you know, that might make the problem a little bit more tractable. Yeah, I don't love the word project, to be honest with you. Oh, you're just saying add registry project. Yeah, in general, I don't love. I haven't yet come up with a term I like here. Actually, I didn't listen. Originally, like resource was the term I used, where like the resource is like very abstractly, the resource is the thing that you're applying, you're associating with an artifact. And so like when you publish a package, you know, like foo version 123.targz, you're associating the resource, which is that name foo123.targz, with this artifact, which is the blob of this hash. It was very abstract and like it made sense to me, but I don't think it made sense to most other people. And so a lot of people read resource and just like too abstract. And so project seems to be one that like, that's like what Python uses. Often like this concept doesn't even have a name in most things. Like in Debian, as far as I can tell, a package, it's just the package name that's this concept. Like a lot of ones, it's like just the name. But name is not exactly right because name is just a string. We really want a name. We want a term for the concept as opposed to like the identifier of the concept. It's a pretty abstract thing. And so ideas here are certainly welcome. Okay. So I think we're out of time. Oops, I have a typo there. Thanks everyone for joining. So next steps here. I'm working on the requirements. How about this for the next steps for this language here? I'm planning on doing an update on the requirements anyway. I'll try to take care of this one. But if anyone has suggestions on the levels, Melba or anyone else, if you want to send a pull request to kind of address that, that would be great, to deconflict. And what were the other next steps? For this one, again, if people have thoughts or ideas, you could send them my way. I'm going to try to clean it up into like a pullable thing. Also, if anyone knows a good way to like define a schema in an actual language and then translate that to Markdown, and wants to set that up, that would be great. I use Proto. I also started looking at Q as well, but again, I want like something to take the schema in the schema definition language and make good nice looking documentation.
Yeah, that was actually something that was being discussed also at KubeCon. It was brought up actually that some of the folks at Q were there and we had a meeting And I don't know about the markdown thing. That's actually an interesting thing. I can see if it's available, but they do have some of that can automatically generate into back and forth between protobuf and Q, as well as a few other things. But I'll check with them to see if they have like a markdown one.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I think what we need is not just the tool that does it, but the whole infrastructure of set up scripts and pre-commit things that checks that we actually do it properly and automatically generate blah blah blah. There's some amount of work there. Cool. All right. Well, it was good seeing everyone. Thanks for coming, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.